Despite being introduced very late into the Arrancar arc, the aspects of death have since become a crucial part of Espada discourse and development. The concept was first mentioned by Barragan in chapter 356. At the time, the idea kind of felt like a tacked-on, last-minute addition to the villainous group, most of whom were already long dead by that point. But over the years, the idea of each member of the Espada representing, embodying, even a deep-rooted cause of death has only grown in popularity and significance, with the individual aspects laying the foundation for retrospective discussion of the characters themselves. I am personally a fan of the concept. It definitely adds another layer to each member of the Espada, though I feel like the concept's influence varies greatly from character to character. For example, going back to Barragan, his entire ability set feels like it was born out of his aspect of death, likely because he is the one who explains the concept to us, and therefore Kubo uses him to showcase and explore that idea more so than anyone else in its fullest capacity. Save for maybe Yami and even Aranero too. Whereas there are some Espada for whom the aspect of death maybe only applies to their personality, for example, and seemingly has little to nothing to do with their abilities. But I think pairing each Espada with a cause of death is clever on a thematic level too. Obviously, they are the villains of the arc, the 10 Blades, and Hollows devour humans. Having each member of the Espada embody what feels like a very human cause of death helps to cement them as terrifying figures within the narrative, bringers of death itself, those whose entire existence revolves around it. But death is also a very human concept, the fear of death itself as an entity anyway. Associating the Espada as such turns them into fearsome entities themselves, but also by connecting them to something so deeply human, it in turn reflects the humanity within each of them as well, however faint. And so in today's video, I want to take a look at each of the Espadas' aspects of death to see how they reflect within the Espada themselves, whether it's in their personality, in their abilities, or elsewhere, perhaps even in their fate. So, let's take a look. And yeah, things look a little bit different in the background. Like I said, it is going to be a work in progress, but we are slowly getting there. Anyway, first up we have the 10th or the 0 Espada, Yami Largo, whose aspect of death is rage. This is quite a simple one, and as I mentioned a moment ago, one of maybe 3 or so aspects in particular that really feels like it was fully baked into the character's ability set, to the point where it encompasses them wholly. Now, Yami has always been an angry guy. It doesn't help that he spends most of his time in the series getting beaten up, but he's often characterized by his seemingly random, explosively violent outbursts, from screaming that he's going to kill Yoroichi to crushing Roka Paramiya's head for no reason. He's proven to be incredibly easy to rile up, as we see when Kisuke taunts him during their second battle, or when Ichigo gets the better of him during the fake Karakura Town arc. Yami absolutely loses his mind after Uryu sends him plummeting from one of the towers of Las Noches, and he even goes so far as to launch a chicken bone at Kukupuro out of anger when the dog won't stop barking. Let's face it, Yami's not the most complex character in Bleach, and the assessment that he's just a hulking rage machine is pretty much spot on. Interestingly though, while Yami's actual power isn't revealed until after Barragan explains the concept of the aspects of death, the release command for his Zanpakuto is revealed to be Enrage, while his Zanpakuto's name is Ira, meaning anger in Spanish. So Kubo was laying it on pretty thick around the time of Yami's Resurrection. Literally every facet of the character links back to rage in some way. He's even seething with rage when he releases his Zanpakuto, which very fittingly just kind of explodes upon activation, maddened by the fact that Ulquiorra is dead and he now won't get to use up all of his stored Reryoku. But of course, the biggest, most overt link to his aspect of death is his central ability, which we don't learn until he releases his Zanpakuto. The angrier he gets, the stronger he gets. Like I said, this is one of the most explicit integrations of the aspects we ever see. And as I've said before, it almost feels like a proto-shrift, in the sense that it encompasses absolutely everything about Yami as a character. It can all be found within his ability. And as Yami grows more and more enraged during his battle with Ichigo and then later with Kenpachi and Byakuya, he eventually transforms a second time, achieving a completely different version of his Resurrection. And interestingly, after the two captains land a massive hit on the Espada, Yami seemingly goes totally insane with rage, losing his mind until he's able to channel that rage into power and evolve. It's hard to say there's really much more to Yami's aspect than this. It doesn't really play into his defeat per se, since he appears to have just never stood a chance against Kenpachi and Byakuya in the first place. Yami's just a big, dumb, angry monster, and there's nothing wrong with that. Up next, we have the 9th Espada Arrancar Ararueri, who represents greed. Again, this feels like a fairly self-explanatory one, and one that is embodied again by almost everything about Arrancaro's powers in particular. Arrancaro's Zanpakuto takes the form of a grotesque, tentacle-like appendage with an enormous mouth that allows him to devour other hollows. And its name is Glotonoria, which is Spanish for gluttony. Upon consuming another hollow, Arrancar takes all of its abilities and Reiatsu for himself, and has amassed a force equal to that of over 30,000 hollows by the time of the story. Arrancar is driven by a desire to devour every hollow he can, taking for himself all that they were. He takes great pride in his ability to evolve limitlessly, and this idea of wanting and having more and more is central to Arrancaro's character. His resurrection is the result of that unfettered greed finally let loose, a shifting, horrific mass of flesh with no real discernible form, the accumulation of everything he has laid bare. Interestingly, Kubo takes the idea of greed as a central theme to Arrancaro's character and reverts it at the time of the Espada's eventual death. As Arrancaro's heads are exposed to the outside world with their tank now shattered, the high-pitched head shrieks endlessly, claiming Aizen promised to release them from their suffering. And so, in the end, while Arrancar gluttonously devoured everything in his path, he died never actually getting what he wanted: freedom from his unending pain. The next Espada on our list is perhaps the first one to not feel so completely married to their aspect of death. The 8th Espada, Xyloporo Granz's aspect of death is madness, and on the surface it does feel like a fairly straightforward and perhaps even basic association. Rather than really manifesting in his abilities, Xyloporo's aspect of death refers to him personally. He is the archetypal mad scientist of the Arrancar, the reflection of Mayuri Kurotsuchi, and so that seems the most obvious parallel. And of course, that insanity does bleed through into his fighting style as well. While not so apparent in his actual powers in the way they look and act, Xyloporo's methods are sadistic and twisted. He watches with glee as he crushes the internal organs of his victims one by one, and when injured himself, madly devours his own fraction in order to heal. Holistically speaking, there is just an erraticism to Xyloporo that seems to reflect his madness overall. On the outside, he's trying to remain calm and composed, even rationalizing his battle as a theatre production that's currently ongoing. But the mask slips on several occasions. Upon realizing Uryu is a Quincy, Xyloporo explodes in a hysterical fit of laughter, and the same is true for when he neutralizes Uryu's later attack. He flies into a mad, unhinged gloating. But perhaps the madness of Xyloporo does run a little deeper than this. His quest for perfection could be seen as mad by some, especially his fellow scientists, as he continuously strives to become the perfect being and never quite achieves it. He's always reaching for the sun above, but it remains just out of his grasp, no matter the so-called splendor he manages to achieve. Then, of course, there's the manner of Xyloporo's death. Mayuri's superhuman drug essentially drives him to insanity if he wasn't there already, forcing Xyloporo to suffer for what feels like an eternity as he waits for Mayuri's sword to pierce his heart, ending his agony at last. We see the sun beating down on a withered and aged Xyloporo, the Espada desperate to be freed of his torment, actually wanting to die, his mind completely addled by Mayuri's drug. So, while Xyloporo's aspect of death isn't so obviously entwined within his character on a surface level, it's quite clearly still there, festering beneath his facade. The seventh Espada Zamari Leroux's aspect of death is intoxication. And again, this is an interesting one. One that I think is pretty obviously apparent in his abilities first and foremost. Zamari's principal ability is Amour, which allows him to take control of an opponent's limb or even their entire body. The idea of losing control is very closely associated with intoxication or addiction, as though Zamari is the drug in question, and those he affects with his power fall under his influence. Take Rukia as a great example. Once Zamari's Amour takes control of her entire body, she's no longer herself, acting upon his every whim. Of course, to go a little deeper than that, Amour means love, something that can be very intoxicating indeed. Interestingly, all of this is only present in Zamari's Resurrection. Really, there's no indication of his aspect of death in his base form whatsoever. As he dies, Zamari espouses his ideology to Byakuya in an explosive rant, unable to see the truth clearly as he's drunk on his own beliefs, as well as his undying devotion to Aizen. In that sense, Zamari is intoxicated by Aizen and the allure of someone Zamari sees as a god, and it's that very intoxication that would eventually lead to Zamari's death in Aizen's war. As was revealed in Can't Fear Your Own World and then confirmed by Kubo in a recent Club Outside post, Espada of the same rank share the same aspect of death, meaning the aspect is affixed to the position itself and not the specific Arrancar, which is kind of weird in my opinion. But that's something we've discussed in depth in a previous video. Here, both Grimmjow and Lupi represent destruction, as both of them held the position of the sixth Espada. And to be honest, destruction is a strange one in general. It's very broad and doesn't feel quite as obvious as many of the other aspects that surround it. What kind of destruction are we referring to here? Is it the destruction of everyone and everything around them, or self-destruction caused by their own instinctual desires? Perhaps it's a fusion of both. Grimmjow, of course, is very animalistic, and wants nothing more than to crush those around him in order to prove himself as the king. In a sense, this is destruction personified. He wanders aimlessly, a beast without a cause, looking for his next meal, his next fight. He lives for battle then, and in that sense destruction feels very fitting. Grimmjow kind of feels like a whirlwind in the early stages of the Arrancar arc, a character who barrels through the story, coming out of nowhere to completely run roughshod all over the place. Even when confronted with stronger characters like Ulquiorra, Grimmjow's willing to fling himself into the fray when backed into a corner. Though, intriguingly, battle wasn't his first instinct in regards to Ulquiorra, deception was. Grimmjow tried to expedite Ichigo's healing before Ulquiorra caught on. I suppose in some way, Grimmjow represents all sides of destruction. He's vicious and violent, and even some of his abilities, specifically his elbow missiles in Resurrection, are purpose-built to cause as much collateral damage as possible. Grimmjow unleashes the Gran Rey Cerro without a second thought, simply caught up in the thrill of battle. He is chaos incarnate, diametrically opposed to a character like Ulquiorra, who represents order and authority. But at the same time, Grimmjow is a self-defeating character. His quest to devour everyone that looks down upon him is destined to fail, and perhaps even end in his own death at the hands of someone much stronger when they inevitably arrive. And then there's Loopy, who I have considerably less to say about, to be totally honest. He feels a lot more disconnected from the theme of destruction in general. It doesn't help that we spend far less time with him by comparison, though he definitely shows destructive tendencies in the sadistic and graphic way he plans on killing Matsumoto during their battle. Can't For Your Own World paints Loopy in a much more ferocious and crazed way, but if we look specifically at the source material, then it doesn't feel like there is really much to go off, but I'd love to hear your thoughts regarding Loopy's aspect of death down in the comments below. The fifth Espada, Neutra Gilga, has perhaps one of the more abstract aspects of death: despair. Again, it's a fascinating one, and it might not be immediately apparent why it belongs to him of all characters. Certainly, despair isn't really reflected in any of Neutra's abilities. I suppose you could say that his nigh impenetrable Hiero might inspire despair in his opponents as they struggle to wound him even slightly, as we see when Ichigo faces off with him briefly, but that feels almost trivial in comparison to how despair is etched into Neutra himself. Despair is at the foundation of his very character, which makes for a wonderful juxtaposition. On the outside, Neutra comes across as this brash, confident monster, but the reality is quite different. As we see in his flashback, Neutra is desperate for some kind of recognition. He believes himself to be the strongest Espada, even if others can't see it, but at the same time he isn't content with leaving it at that. The foundation of Neutra's despair comes from no one acknowledging him, no one giving him what it is that he really wants deep down, which is that if someone exists that is truly stronger than him, then at least give him a warrior's death. He wants to die before his body has even hit the ground in the midst of battle. Neutra is similar to Grimmjow in that he will continuously seek out stronger opponents. But when Neutra finds one he truly despises in Nell, she never gives him the satisfaction he desires. Instead, she belittles him and treats him like a child, and in return he lashes out like a child with grievous consequences. Although Neutra erroneously believes himself to be the strongest of the Espada, in reality what he craves is strength, and the acknowledgement that comes with that. Neutra is stuck in a vicious cycle of trying to prove himself only to be brushed off. By wounding Nell and inadvertently reducing her to a child, Neutra cements himself in that cycle of anguish, never to escape it until someone comes along to free him. In the end, it is Kenpachi who gives Neutra what he wants. He sets him free from that cycle by putting an end to him, giving him the warrior's death he craved as an acknowledgement of his power. When Neutra dies, he locks eyes with Nell, as if still seeking her approval even now. Neutra feels like a brutally misunderstood character in some sense. He's a monster, of that there is no doubt, but he is relentlessly tormented as well. On the flip side of that, the fourth Espada, Ulquiorra Schiffer, is fairly clear-cut when it comes to his aspect of death: emptiness. Ulquiorra represents the void, nothingness, the endless abyss of black from which he himself crawled out of when he was born into Hueco Mundo. As such, Ulquiorra is almost completely emotionless, but going further than that, he has a fundamental lack of understanding of human emotion too. In that sense, Ulquiorra doesn't just represent the void, but also the very concept of void itself, of missing or lacking something. It's for this reason that it often felt like Ulquiorra was depicted as the ultimate hollow, or at least the embodiment, the closest embodiment of what it means to be a hollow. Ulquiorra views humanity as alien, and yet it clings to him anyway, refusing to die, manifesting slightly in the moment of his eventual death. Ulquiorra doesn't believe in the spiritual, nor the ethereal, nor anything outside of what his own eyes can see. If something isn't reflected in his eye, then it doesn't exist. And Ulquiorra struggles to grapple with metaphysical concepts like the heart, that forms the bonds of friendship between Orihime and her friends, something that they all sense and feel and will fight for, even though it's not a physical, tangible thing. And yet, to Ulquiorra, it absolutely must be. Lest, how can it possibly be? How can it exist? Ulquiorra expects to readily see it in order to believe it, going so far as to wonder if the heart actually exists or not, and that were he to crack open Orihime's skull, maybe he would find it there, this concept that humans are so obsessed with. It's only in death that Ulquiorra realizes what the heart is and where it resides, even in him. The concept of emptiness is also present in some of Ulquiorra's abilities too, specifically his signature Cero Oscurus, the Black Cero. Now, while this is an ability that can be used by any Espada, let's face it, Kubo designed it as something to be associated with Ulquiorra. Cero Oscurus is a black mass that consumes everything relentlessly. Pure, unshakable darkness that looks like an empty pit itself. And so it's like the idea of the void, the abyss, nothingness encroaching upon all that is. To be fair, Ulquiorra is another Espada who really does feel like the personification of his own aspect of death. That emptiness, that not understanding such spiritual themes is the key to Ulquiorra as a character. As we reach the top 3 Espada, we once again find ourselves with a pair of characters sharing the same aspect of death. Harabel and Neliel both represent sacrifice. Interestingly, I think it was the mobile game Bleach Brave Souls that coined Nell's aspect as being lamentation as part of their Can't Fear Your Own World cross-promotion, but it's since been debunked, and Nell in fact represents sacrifice along with Harabel. Sacrifice feels like a special, peculiar aspect in comparison to the rest. It's the only one of the 10 that feels inherently selfless or implies a level of selflessness in a way, even though it doesn't necessarily have to. Perhaps selfless isn't the right word here, but it's the one aspect that implies some kind of loving or meaningful connection to someone else. And that connection needs to be severed in some way for this aspect to be truly realised. If we begin with Harabel, in the source material, she's been shown to care deeply for her fraction, the Tre Bestia. They're a tight-knit unit that actually shares a bond, and when the Trebestia are all wiped out by Yamamoto in the Fate Karakura Town arc, that gives Harabel the push she needs to take things up a gear. In that sense, her Fraction were sacrificed in order to awaken Harabel. That thing she cared about was brutally cut down, opening the floodgates. After the defeats of the Trebestia, Harabel engages Hitsugaya with her Resurrection and violently, effortlessly overpowers him before even turning her gaze to Yamamoto himself. The usually composed and stoic Harabel considered taking the fight to the Captain Commander in order to avenge her comrades. It was their sacrifice, as unwitting as it may be, that propelled Harabel to take action. In this sense, the defeats of the Trebestia were given meaning. They didn't fall in vain, at least in the short term, as Harabel grew stronger thanks to it. The great irony here is that Harabel's own defeat comes at the hands of the man she believed in, but Aizen simply sacrifices her on the altar of his scheme, ensuring that her death meant nothing at all as she plummets from the sky. You can see the rage on Harabel's face as she tries to kill Aizen in that moment. Everything she and her friends had given up in his name had just been thrown back in her face. Harabel is of course taken prisoner. She offers herself up as sacrifice in the face of the Vandenreich's looming threat, which is given even more prominence in the anime as we see that she purposefully uses herself as a diversion, as a decoy in a sense to allow Nell and her brothers to escape the onslaught. Meanwhile, speaking of which, there is Nell, whose association again feels fairly obvious, albeit slightly less complex. Like Harabel, she too has friends that she cares for in her Fraction, Pesce, and Donderchaka. As discussed earlier, Neutra was despairing over Nell's failure to acknowledge him, and so he vengefully attacked Pesce and Donderchaka, ripping their masks from them and forever stunting their growth, completely destroying the life that Nell and her brothers had up until that moment. Nell herself was sacrificed and cast out, thrown aside by Neutra after he viciously struck her down, after she lost her composure upon seeing her friends so horrendously injured. And then of course Nell is reawakened, returned to her adult self after witnessing Ichigo's sacrifice for her on the field of battle, after watching him give it his all and be brutally beaten as a result, as he tries to do everything he can to protect her. The second Espada, Baragon Luisenbahn, is the one who introduced us to the concept of the aspects of death in the first place. As such, he is one of the Espada who most prominently embodies his particular aspect, aging, or simply time itself. When you think about it, looking back on Baragon's speech regarding the aspects, it reads a little weirdly in retrospect. Baragon notes that they are, and I quote, our abilities, our thoughts, and the reasons for our existence. But considering the aspects of death are presumably a creation of Aizen's, this feels like an uncharacteristic capitulation from the Espada who hated Aizen the most. Anyway, Baragon's aspect of death is obvious in all facets of the character. For example, his outward appearance. Baragon is the only elderly Arrancar in the entire army, time etched into his very face. And then of course his Resurrection Arrogante transforms him into a regal skeleton draped in a shadowy cloak and lofty golden crown. A depiction of Father Time himself perhaps, the skeleton itself a well-renowned image of age, decay, and death. Baragon goes even further than most, however, in how his aspect of death is portrayed. Even in his base form, Baragon is constantly surrounded by a field of time dilation that slows incoming attacks to a crawl. But even more than that, he can also affect the aging of others. Simply by touching Soifon, Baragon causes her bones to age and break in a crazy display of power. A power that comes directly from the source, which is Baragon's aspect of death. Honestly, that part of Baragon's abilities feels like it goes overlooked because everyone just thinks about Respirar and Baragon's Resurrection, which is totally fair. It's just crazy to me that he even had this kind of power in his base form too. Again, it's a little similar to Yami's in the sense that it almost feels like a shrift in that it's so all-encompassing. The idea of time is so completely central to Baragon as a character and his abilities that it is him in a sense. And then, of course, once he transforms, Baragon's most fearsome ability is Respirar, his aspect of death totally personified and brought to life. Respirar is a sickly purple smog that Baragon can emit, and anything that comes into contact with it rapidly ages and decays, turning to dust. It's the ultimate weaponization of the aspects of death, and it makes Baragon a truly terrifying picture of time itself. And of course, for a character who is so rooted in this concept, he was always going to live and die by it quite literally as well. Baragon's death is born out of his own power. Respirar is turned against him and he crumbles to dust. In the same way he continuously enforced the idea that his power is absolute, it was enough to eventually bring him down as well. And so that leaves us with the first Espada, Coyote Stark, and his aspect of death, loneliness. Stark embodies the idea of the lone wolf quite literally, with the lupine theme running rampant across his entire character design, especially once he releases his Zanpakuto, Los Lobos. Stark's aspect of death is very neatly woven into his character in my opinion. It's another one that feels quite obvious and clear-cut, but it's not as overt as the likes of Yami's Rage or Baragon's Time. Stark's entire mysterious backstory is rooted in loneliness. We never see his original form. And the reason is, it split itself into Stark and Lilinet in order to escape the loneliness it felt as a result of its overwhelming, ostracizing power. Power so great that it simply killed their friends by being around them. Stark is a lone wanderer, and yet the great irony of his aspect of death is that it's the only one held by effectively two Espada at the same time. Both Stark and Lilinet are the Primera Espada, meaning they are never technically alone. And this idea is prominent throughout Stark's abilities too. The first Espada's ultimate power, the one that really defines them, allows Stark to continuously split his soul, creating an army of flaming soul wolves, each one embodying both Stark and Lilinet. We've never seen anything like this before, and I maintain that this is one of the strongest, craziest abilities of the series. Stark is so unbelievably strong with a near limitless pool of Reryoku that his soul can be constantly pulled apart to create additional offshoots of himself. There's a notion there that Stark's loneliness is completely inescapable. It is totally consuming him. Even though he can constantly create new versions of himself, it is still just him at the end of the day. No one else is capable of withstanding his presence. And yet, in death, Stark is granted something of a reprieve by Kubo. As he falls, he recounts his first meeting with Lilinet. The two of them realise they can do anything and go anywhere so long as they have each other. And in that moment of clarity, on the brink, on the precipice of death, Stark sees his Espada companions laid out before him. Virtually everyone we've mentioned on this list until now, and realises that he was never alone. Stark's aspect of death is completely subverted in his moment of death, and that feels pretty rare. In fact, there is a delicate balance here. Some Espada are completely and utterly consumed by their aspects of death in their final moments, to the point where some of them are practically led to their deaths by them, forced to face them at the very end. But on the other side of that, I would argue a few manage to actually escape their aspects of death at the last minute. As they reach oblivion, the likes of Stark, Ulquiorra and Neutra manage to avoid the call of their aspects of death and are set free at the end. But that's it for the Espada aspects of death. As we reach the end of this video, we have to ask ourselves again, what exactly are they? Where do they come from? And really, what do they represent? What do they mean to the Espada? And crucially, what do they mean to Aizen, who bestowed them upon his strongest warriors? Do they reflect the ways each Espada died as a human? Is it something that's followed them all the way through the afterlife, perhaps? I remember reading a while back that the aspects of death in a narrative sense stem from Kubo originally wanting to theme the Espada on the 7 deadly sins, before deciding to change course and go a different direction, with those sins embodied now by Aizen himself. But you can still see the influence of the sins lingering here too. Hell, the chapters focusing on Ulquiorra's battle and subsequent death are named after them. Anyway, that's it for this video, guys. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. It was a lot of fun going back to the Espada and diving deep into their characters some more, but as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. What do you think of the aspects of death? Do you think they work for the Espada as characters, or do you think they are just a tacked-on addition right towards the end of the Arrancar arc? Which aspect of death do you think fits its character the best, and which one do you think fits its character the worst? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without whom I couldn't do this, and I really do appreciate each and every one of you so very much. If you love what I do here over on YouTube and you too want to support me over on Patreon, thank you. You can follow the link in the description below and become a supporter at the $1 tier to get your name in the credits of every single video just like this. And by supporting me at the $2 tier or higher, you can get every single video of mine absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, that's it for the video. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.